Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm going to talk about how to play a Protection Warrior in Dragonflight patch 10.2. This is primarily going to focus on how to play the class, because it's a guide, and if you want more of a deep dive on the philosophy of the class, then I would say you should check out the State of the Class video I made a few weeks ago. Now let's just start with the changes. Rallying Cry has been nerfed from 15% bonus health to 10% bonus health. Additionally, Inspiring Presence, the talent that buffed it by 5% and 3 seconds of duration, is being removed entirely. Okay, so the positive here is that you kind of get back a talent point that you were having to dedicate to group utility, so that's not all bad for you as a prot warrior. On the other hand, this is a decent sized nerf to a raid cooldown. Honestly, I think it matters more for raid leaders and comp building than it does for individual spec balance. I think you could say it means you're less likely, slightly less likely, to stack warriors in high level raiding. I don't think you were really going to have to stack tons of them anyway, especially with DPS warrior maybe not being so great right now. And that's it for changes. Now let's talk about how it plays. There's a sense that Protection Warrior is a super simple class, and on one level, that is absolutely correct. I think it's one of the simplest tanks in the game in terms of the base rotation. That is really not that cluttered. You don't have a lot of rotational skills, especially compared to the likes of Brewmaster Monk and Blood DK. That being said, there is a reactive component to using Shield Slam effectively, since it has a cooldown that can reset, so you need a lot of moment-to-moment awareness to play Prot Warrior well. Beyond that, Prot Warrior just has a really high APM compared to a lot of tanks. It has a lot of skills that are off the global cooldown, which is great, but it means your hands are going to get a pretty good workout. You actually need some hand and wrist strength to play Prot Warrior. Yeah. So while the rotation is pretty simple, you have a lot of cooldowns. Most of them are offensive. In terms of defensive cooldowns, Prot Warrior's toolkit is pretty generic. We're talking about stuff like Shield Wall and Last Stand. They're usually good skills, but they're rarely strategy redefining like Divine Shield or Anti-Magic Shell. The one exception is Spell Reflection, which is awesome when it works, and it usually does in Mythic Plus, but it rarely does in raids. The way Warrior compensates for their small defensive cooldown toolkit is by having really good base damage mitigation and through cooldown reduction on all of their main cooldowns. Cooldown reduction rules. It's probably the single most fun and interesting mechanic in video games, and it's certainly one of my favorite aspects of Warriors. I think Warrior's amazing new tier set is going to make them much stronger in the coming raid in Mythic Plus season than they were in Season 2, which is a welcome relief from the, horrible flaming garbage prison that they were stuck in for all of the last season. And that's all the good stuff about Warrior. Now here's the bad part. Warriors are extremely reliant on healers to survive. They have amazing damage mitigation tools, they have some limited self-healing tools, and Ignore Pain does its best at mitigating a steady stream of damage. But one of the reasons people love Blood DK is how effective it is at controlling its own destiny. You're able to be largely self-sufficient as Blood. As a warrior, you are reliant. You need those healers to keep you alive. You're like an enormous, giant, wounded athlete limping off the field of play with someone who's tucked their entire body under your arm helping you stay on your feet. But I think that really is the only downside to Warrior in the coming season of Dragonflight. You are reliant on external healing. But your mitigation is great. Your damage is competitive once again, the tier set rules, and the underlying class has gotten enough buffs over the last 6 or 8 months to make it a quality tank once again. Now let's talk about Prot Warrior's Season 3 tier set bonuses, and here they are. 2-piece bonus, Spending Rage, has a chance to cause your next Shield Slam to consume your bleeds on a target, instantly dealing 40% of the remaining damage, 100% for Thunderous Roar, and reducing your damage taken by 10% for 5 seconds. The 4-piece bonus, for each bleed consumed from a target, your damage taken is reduced by an additional 2%. When Shield Slam consumes a bleed, the cooldown of Thunderclap is reset, and the cooldown of Thunderous Roar is reduced by 3 seconds. These bonuses provide anywhere from 15 to 25% more single target damage. That's really at the high end, but still, upwards of 10% more damage in AoE, easily. 14 to 16% damage reduction from all sources, pretty much all the time, and 40% cooldown reduction on Thunderous Roar. This is all amazing stuff. You can very reasonably maintain upward of 80% on time on the damage reduction buff, but very reasonably pushing into the 90% range. This effectively gives you a second layer of like defensive stance level mitigation or demo shout level mitigation, and it comes with a great damage bonus as well. This tier set is amazing in raids and actually pretty amazing in Mythic Plus too. It provides constant damage mitigation, direct damage, and cooldown reduction. It's thematically good, it's conceptually good, and the tuning on it's really good. It's also very fun to use thanks to the 4-piece bonuses, Thunderclap resets, which increase your rage generation and your Shield Slam cooldown reset frequency. It just gives you a lot more to do. I really, really like this tier set bonus, as you can tell from my enthusiasm. The patch isn't even out yet. I mean, I wrote this quite a bit ago. The patch is now out. But the tier isn't out, and even at this point, I am hoping that this bonus lives on into the future of the talent tree because it is awesome. Huge fan, probably my favorite tier set of the entire expansion. One thing that I almost forgot to include in here is that for some reason Ignore Pain has a much, much higher proc chance per point of rage spent on the 2-piece bonus than any of your other rage spenders. So the chance, I think, is something along the lines of like half or 0.5% chance to proc per point of rage spent. Basically, like if you spend 20 rage on a revenge, you get about a 10% chance to proc. It's something like that. But for whatever reason, Ignore Pain, if you cast Ignore Pain, you get about a 75 to 80% chance to proc. This adds a ton of offensive value, and defensive value for that matter, onto casting Ignore Pain, and it makes it so that you really want to hit Ignore Pain basically any time that this proc isn't up, and then you kind of want to not cast Ignore Pain again until you've consumed the proc with a Shield Slam. And that kind of creates a back and forth, sort of a little mini game or a meta game within this tier set bonus, where as soon as that proc is up, you're consuming it as quickly as you can with Shield Slam. You're never letting Shield Slam sit on cooldown, hoping for a proc, but you are trying to fish for those procs and get Shield Slam up in the same like span of time. It's pretty cool. I really, really enjoy the interaction there. Now let's talk about talents. I have 2 main talent setups to consider here, with a small variation depending on whether you're in single target or AoE in raids. All right, so here I have 3 talent setups, a Mythic Plus setup, a single target setup, and an AoE setup, and those last 2 are both for raids. Now, I did this on the PTR instead of on the live servers, because on the live servers, my talents are a little different based on the fact that I don't have the Season 3 tier set yet, because at the time that I'm recording this, Season 3 isn't even out, and that will affect your talents a little bit. We'll kind of get to that in a bit. But first, let's just start with the must-have talents, and then we'll kind of go into the stuff you can move around. There's quite a bit that you can move around, and then most of everything else is pretty much locked in place. So let's start there. First off, for anything AoE oriented, you're going to want to take Seismic Reverberation. So this is going to apply to raid. You know, if you're doing a single target raid fight, Seismic Reverberation, literally worthless. If you're doing anything where you're going to hit 3 targets or more with Revenge pretty often throughout, it's a must-have. Also in Mythic Plus, I've taken Endurance Training and Shockwave as my sort of default Mythic Plus setup. This is very defensive. If you really want to go for a more normal offensive setup, and I probably will outside of the initial kind of start of the season, you're going to take Uproar, and you're probably just going to put that last point into Cruel Strikes for more crit chance. And that's going to give you a lot more damage. It's going to synergize really nicely with your tier set bonus, reducing the cooldown of Thunderous Roar. But, you know, this Shockwave setup is a little bit more defensive, utility-oriented for your group's sake. Additionally, I haven't taken Pain and Gain. The average healing per second from Pain and Gain is really small. It's like less than 4,000 HPS in my current gear. I just like the utility of Bounding Stride, but obviously if you're doing any sort of super difficult pushing, you could take Pain and Gain instead. Other than that, there's a lot of mandatory stuff. Avatar, Unstoppable Force, those are both mandatory. Thunderous Roar and Thunderous Words, those are mandatory. Intimidating Shout and Stormbolt are certainly mandatory in Mythic Plus. And over here in the right-hand tree, most of this stuff is mandatory. Pretty much everything straight down the middle up until Battle-Scarred Veteran, and not including Battle-Scarred Veteran, is going to be mandatory. There are a couple of things you can move around, though. For example, Blood Surge isn't necessarily mandatory. It's really good in Mythic Plus and AoE situations as a source of extra rage. But in terms of damage output, if you really wanted to maximize your damage output and you weren't worried about having spell block and needing spell block to stay alive, you could drop both it and Blood Surge, put 2 points in Bloodborne, and that would be a little bit better for damage output. But again, that's more for slamming. Additionally, Heavy Repercussions is basically a little bit of a choice you have to make here. Into the Fray is better for damage output. It'll be better in raids, it'll be better in Mythic Plus for damage output too, but if you run Heavy Repercussions, you're going to have an easy time maintaining 100% shield block uptime, no question. If you run Into the Fray instead, you're going to have a little more trouble unless you also take Bolster. Now at the start of the season, without the new tier set, that's exactly how I'm going to be playing it, and that's why I didn't do this on live servers. On the start of the season, it's going to be Into the Fray and Bolster together, easy peasy. Once we pick up the new tier set, that kind of goes away. Bolster really loses a lot of value once you start losing the old tier set bonuses, and you kind of are free to pick up Spell Block again, which is really, really good. Spell Block is a massive defensive cooldown. I mean, it basically has 33% uptime on... You kind of can't be killed by spells while Spell Block is up, which is pretty great. But then you have to compensate for that loss of shield block uptime, and that's where Heavy Repercussions comes in. Now, it depends on what kind of content you're doing. If you're doing content that really isn't all that challenging for you defensively, you don't have to run Heavy Repercussions. You can run Into the Fray. You'll still have very high uptime on shield block, just not 100%. Beyond that, most of these talents down here, Violent Outburst, Indomitable, Booming Voice, Shield Charge, and both of the talents underneath it, they're all pretty much locked in. You could potentially drop Blood Surge and Bolster and then take Into the Fray and also have Spell Block. That's definitely an option. One thing that has been a significant change from Season 2, especially the start of Season 2, is that Thunderlord has completely taken over in this sort of left-hand middle of the pack here. Show of Force has lost a lot of value, really doesn't add nearly as much damage as Thunderlord with the increased Demoralizing Shout uptime. Now, one little deviation here that this Thunderlord shift causes, you have way higher Demoralizing Shout uptime, which is great. But this means that your Demoralizing Shout and Shield Charge are no longer like perfectly synced all the time. So that's okay, it's worth it. I mean, having all that extra uptime on a major offensive, defensive, and rage-generating cooldown like Demoralizing Shout is worth it, but it does mean that there might be some spots where you want to hold Shield Charge for a second or two to get Demoralizing Shout back up, or maybe you just want to free fire a Shield Charge that isn't being juiced by Demoralizing Shout, kind of the worst case scenario. But that's pretty much it for the Mythic Plus talents. Now let's take a look at the single target raid talents, and there's not going to be a huge difference between these and the AoE raid talents. The main thing here obviously is you're not messing with Seismic Reverberation for pure single target, and this is pretty much a talent setup you can run for almost all of raids. You're orienting a lot more toward single target damage and also some mobility utility like Bounding Stride, a very low to single target damage talent in the form of Honed Reflexes. You could very easily justify dropping this and taking Pain and Gain if you needed to. That's also not going to be a huge defensive gain either. I maybe could even justify taking Intervene just for the extra mobility skill. I think that's definitely on the table. But you'll note that we've taken Overwhelming Rage, and Overwhelming Rage is really nice. I just like that extra max rage. It really gives you a lot more freedom with your resource generation, helps with overcapping, preventing that. The reason you don't take it in the Mythic Plus talent setup is you just have a lot of points that you have to spend in things like Stormbolt and Intimidating Shout and Seismic Reverberation that, you know, those kind of all go away in the raid talent setup, and they're kind of free to take that quality of life talent here, Overwhelming Rage, that doesn't really do anything for throughput. If you're playing correctly, it just makes it easier to play correctly. Additionally, you'll see we're not taking that point in Instigate that we used to. Even under ideal circumstances, Bloodborne is going to be worth more damage because it interacts so wonderfully with the tier set. Additionally, if you have any situation in raid where you don't feel like you need spell block, which could be all the time, depends, you know, on how hard the content you're doing is relative to your gear level and so on, you can potentially drop that point in spell block, take a second in Bloodborne, and that's even more damage that you're getting out of that. Other than that, in single target, you really do want to have sudden death, and I think that you can run this talent setup for all of the raid. The only two fights that I would say maybe you would want to run the AoE talent setup for are Gnarl Root, because this is a fight that has a lot of ads, And then Council of Dreams, because it's a 3-target fight where you could potentially get a nice 3-target cleave. There's also Llarold. There's a handful of ads in this fight, but they're not quite as plentiful as they are in Gnarlroot. And then most of the other fights, Agira and Volcaros, those are straight single target. Smolder on straight single target. Tendril single target. Naimu it has ads, but you're always single targeting whatever you're fighting, so that's single target. And then, yeah, Farrak, we don't really know. So with that being said, here is the AoE talent setup. And the main shifts, as you can see, they're pretty minor. You're taking Seismic Reverberation, because you want to have that if you're not doing pure single target. Thunderlord, that's an option. I probably would still think about running Sudden Death. It really depends on which of those fights. If you're able to get the group of council mobs stacked together, then Thunderlord can be pretty nice. Sudden Death's probably going to be a little bit more consistent in terms of damage output, and then Blood Surge is just there to give you some more rage to be more defensively minded. Again, I think if I were not worried about defenses all that much, focusing a little bit more on damage, I would drop Blood Surge, and again, probably drop that second point out of Spell Block and just do 2 in Bloodborne. And then there you go. That looks like a nice AoE raid talent setup. Now let's talk about abilities. Shield Slam is your main rotational skill. It's your main rage generator, and you have a ton of great talents that add extra value onto it, as well as your tier set. Thunderclap is your secondary rage generator and a great damage dealing spell in AoE. Revenge is your main offensive rage spender. Execute is better for single target damage, but it only works when enemies are in execute range or when Sudden Death procs if you're talented into that. When you have Avatar active, if you're talented into Unstoppable Force, which you should be, Thunderclap will hit quite a bit harder, and it kind of becomes your core skill in AoE. Your rotation sort of looks like Thunderclap, Shield Slam, Thunderclap, Revenge, Thunderclap, Shield Slam, Thunderclap, something else, and so on. As for your main defensive skills, you have Shield Block, which you want to maintain 100% of the time that you're tanking. So in raids, that means you won't necessarily have it 100% of the time all the time, but you won't necessarily be tanking all the time. In Mythic Plus, the goal really is to have it up at all times. Your talent setup should make this pretty easy. If you're taunt swapping a boss back and forth, you can let it drop when you're not tanking. And, in Mythic Plus, you're pretty much going to have it up all the time. The difference in terms of damage intake between taking a blocked hit and an unblocked hit is quite substantial. After that, you have Ignore Pain to absorb any damage that gets past your shield, and you can use Impending Victory as a quick self-heal when your health drops low. Demoralizing Shout and Shield Charge are kind of a 2-button combo if you're not running Thunderlord. They both offer a blend of offensive and defensive value, so if you're running, in a raid setup, you're running Sudden Death, then you would hit Demo Shout and then Shield Charge, does a huge burst of damage and gives you a lot of damage reduction in rage. If you're in a Mythic Plus situation where you have Thunderlord and they're kind of desynced in terms of cooldown, that's okay. They both basically do kind of similar things. They generate a bunch of rage, add a lot of damage, and give you some form of damage reduction. So in either case, they kind of serve similar purposes. As for Shield Wall, be liberal with it. The cooldown is very short. You get so much cooldown reduction from your kit. And the same goes for Spell Reflection, not the cooldown reduction, but the cooldown being very short. You should really be very liberal with Spell Reflection. Anything that you are able to reflect, you should try to do so. Anything that is spell damage that you're not able to reflect, you should still try to have it up so that it's helping mitigate that damage. Finally, I'm just going to mention that Rallying Cry and Last Stand both exist, and they are both useful as sort of proactive defensive cooldowns that you can use to prevent dying from some sort of big predictable hit, or as reactive cooldowns that you can use when your health suddenly drops low and you weren't expecting it. It'll buy you a bit of breathing room, let the healers get you back up. Alright, now I want to talk about how to pull on a Protection Warrior. This is something I always try to specifically go over because I know that pulling packs of mobs and just the starts of pulls can be challenging for new players, kind of the most dangerous section of most pulls. So here goes. I like to start out by charging in and hitting Thunderclap. I ideally want to get Shield Block up as quickly as I can in the pull, if I can hit Charge and Shield Block, if maybe I have a little bit of rage left over, that's perfect. I also try to hit Avatar when I'm in mid-charge and then use Thunderclap immediately afterwards so that Thunderclap is getting buffed by Avatar. Then I would use Shield Block and you'll definitely have the rage to do so at that point. I would try to hit Demoralizing Shout as soon as I can get everything near me, and then Shield Charge immediately after that so that I'm doing a huge burst of damage, and that'll lock up Threat. That definitely will get Threat locked up. But, you know, then from there I'll hit more Thunderclap and try to use the rest of my offensive cooldowns, things like Thunderous Roar, Ravager, or maybe Shockwave if I'm using that. You'll definitely have Threat at that point, no problems. You also want to use Shield Slam to generate rage and consume those tier set 2-piece bonuses, but getting that AoE damage out at the very start of a pull is really important for locking up Threat, and then you can go into a more normal rotation. Now, if you don't have Avatar up, you could still use Thunderclap and Revenge, and that probably will get Threat locked up, but if you have absolutely nothing available and everything's really going badly, you can hit Challenging Shout, and that's an AoE taunt, and that'll do the job too eventually. Or, I mean, immediately, but you know, it's kind of the worst case scenario, which as it turns out, still isn't all that bad. In terms of stats, warriors want to enchant and gem for haste, and then critical strike is your second best secondary stat in Mythic Plus. It's better for damage reduction overall over the course of a run than versatility, but it's, you know, a little less consistent. It gives you more parry chance, which is great. It also gives you a little bit more damage than versatility. In raids, that's kind of flipped. Versatility is better for stuff that you're not able to parry, boss hits, spell damage, damage over time effects. So it's a little bit more defensively consistent, still not quite as good offensively, but a little bit stronger defensively. In any case, all of the stats are pretty good. You really want to focus primarily on item level, so strength. All right, I think that's pretty close to it. I just want to say, like, I really love Protection Warrior. Working on this guide and working on the Wowhead guide and testing on the PTR on it, I was just so reminded of how much I love this class. And I mean, really, like, what a low point recently Season 2 of Dragonflight has been for Prot Warrior. And it wasn't even like it was all that bad. You know, you could be the worst place candidate in a group of 6 and still not be all that bad. And that's basically where Prot Warrior was. It was fine and fun enough. But in Season 3, it really is rocketing back up in terms of fun, in terms of power, in terms of my desire to play a lot of it. And that's all great. Like, I am so excited to play Prot Warrior in the coming season. I think I've said that about all the tanks, but it's really true about Prot Warrior. It's not like it's all that new, but just the little bit of a mini game that's being added with the way that this tier set functions is just so awesome. And I'm really excited to get in there and kind of do a ton of damage and get a bunch of cooldown reduction out of this awesome tier set. All right, that is it. Thanks for watching. Bye.